our society, one of the leading ideologies and philosophies taking the world by storm is wokeism. It's been going on for about what, 6 years, and it hasn't been around for a long time. It's just suddenly just popped up out of nowhere. It's making people scratch their heads, wondering why it's having such a stronghold on society within the lives of everyday people, even celebrities as well. And on top of that, wonder what its origins are. Well, luckily, there's a man, a well-known economist and former Marxist, uh, Thomas Sowell, who had an interview back in 1995 where he talked about um, what he calls uh, the Anointed, based off his book titled "The Vision of the Anointed," which explains the intelligentsia who have this particular mindset that's pretty much called today wokeism. So we're going to go ahead and delve into this video, see what he has to say. And I also want to keep in mind, these are excerpts from the interview, not the full interview, but excerpts in regards to this particular topic. But still, it's a great backdrop for me to utilize to give my commentary here and there. And we'll see what happens. Let's see what the man says. So let's get it.
The Vision of the Anointed. Now that's an interesting title. Who are the anointed?
They're the elite in the media, in politics, all of those who think that third parties ought to be making people's decisions for them. The subtitle is Self-Congratulation as a Basis for Social Policy. In other words, people who think that everything that's wrong with the country is due to the fact that other people are just not as smart as they are. And if only they could, or people like them could take over and make our decisions, we'd be so much better off.
But
Absolutely. And what's interesting is that, back in the day, under the guise of classic liberalism, or in this case, this classic liberals, that at one point they actually used to understand and tolerate people's differences, their thought patterns, and their beliefs. Ain't that something? But that shows you just how far left these people have gone, which is why we're seeing what we're seeing today in regards to virtue signaling, and pretty much, again, like he's pointed out, making the world believe that their way of thinking, their thought process, their mindset, their beliefs should be everyone's, which is why this notion of diversity is honestly a joke. Yeah, because they're about diversity when it comes to appearance, but they're not about diversity when it comes to thought. Because anyone who has a different thought process aside from them, they're labeled as stupid. You're not on the same level as they are. And they're pretty much just cast you at the bottom of the barrel.
in early America, didn't this sort of educated class make the decisions for everybody?
As far as governmental decisions,
Yeah.
but the government itself didn't make the decisions for everyone.
Uh-huh.
Now, you can't decide where your kid's going to school. You can't decide whether or not they can move a halfway house for drug users next door to you or whatnot.
It's out of your control. The government decides
That's
that
right.
stuff.
The government decides too many things. They decide also how your children are going to be raised. You may have an idea about at what age children should be introduced to sex and in what manner, with what kind of moral commitments.
You mean as a parent?
A parent, yes. The schools have taken that over. By the time you even think about it, they've already had years, of showing.
They're passing out condoms to these kids.
Passing out condoms is not even the half of it. They're showing motion pictures of naked couples engaging in sex, both homosexual and heterosexual, in the 7th grade. And if you complain about it, that's considered to be censorship.
You don't.
Exactly. AKA cancel culture, which is definitely having a huge impact today. to where they're not just canceling uh, people, but also they're canceling dead people too. Probably some examples include the likes of John Wayne, Aretha Franklin, and Mr. Rogers. This is, this is a level of insanity, man. And going back to what he just stated about the public school system and what they're teaching children. Back in the day, yes, they were showing, like you said, examples of sex between both heterosexuals and homosexuals. And in regards to condoms, yes, uh, that was some level of extreme. But today, they're having drag queens in these schools where they're pretty much turning children out to the LGBTQXYZ lifestyle, right? And just a few months ago, they had that Valencia added, which that right there, man, that's very blatant, very blatant. And on top of that, they're even teaching little children to twerk nowadays. Yeah, that's right, TWERK, twerk. It's bad enough for seeing twerking today, but now they're passing this down to little children. Little children ain't supposed to know anything about sex right now at that age. They're supposed to be learning about their ABCs, um, with reading in class, with hide go seek, play hide go seek, man. Having recess, nap time, learn how to potty. Children, kid stuff. That's what's supposed to be learning right at that age. They ain't supposed to be learning nothing about sex at that point. That's supposed to come later on when they get older and come of age. And the people who should really be teaching them about that are the parents, the mother and father. All right, those are the main people who should be teaching their children about that stuff, especially when they're going to come to them with questions, right? Which is very commonplace. But yeah, man, definitely. I mean, Tom was definitely on point. All right, because he knew about this stuff from the get go. So I admire that and applaud that about him. So big thumbs up.
You can't pull your kid out of school and say they don't have to put up with this stuff. I guess you could,
No.
but you'd be.
Well, if you have a private school to put him in, but you have compulsory attendance laws, and if you don't have the money for private schools, then you're stuck.
Where did
Well, I wouldn't necessarily say you're stuck per se, and that's again another great point and definitely a great idea in regards to what is going on in these schools, not just in regards to again the LGBTQP lifestyle, and also on top of that Satanism, but also in regards to these mass shootings. Now, for people who research those things, probably know off the bat that a lot of those things are pre-planned. But still, even with that, children's lives are lost, and also probably even adults, if not so, but definitely children. And so, definitely a great idea and a solution for that um, is definitely yes, definitely put your children into one of these private charter schools. That's if you can afford it, definitely. But if you can't, the next best thing after that is homeschooling, because years ago, parents actually used to homeschool their children. All right, and the parents taught the children what they needed to know. Right, depending on what age they were, and what they learned from a certain age, it was for that age. And as they got older, they started learning more advanced things. The same way in the school. But it was definitely better back then, as opposed to today.
this country get off the track and decide that the federal government should make most of our decisions?
Well, it started to some extent in the New Deal, but I think the 1960s is sort of the golden age, if you want to put it that way, of this whole mindset. And that's what the book's about. It's about a mindset. It's not about a series of policies, but of showing how in policy after policy, those who think a certain way will try to take over other people's decisions.
How do you characterize
Absolutely, and I gotta say, and definitely glad that he mentioned the '60s because that was a very transformative year for America and even other parts of the world. Because now, in regards to particularly the black community, that was definitely a disaster for us because it pretty much took away from the household the father through LBJ's what the Great Society, pretty much, where the man was not only kicked out of the home, but that the wife, the mother, the woman was given financial assistance, right? To the point she became more independent, and that she was pretty much labeled the shot caller, and where the man was pretty much dehumanized. He was labeled a deadbeat dad, things of that nature. And not to no, and don't get it twisted. Were there definitely men and brothers at that time who just voluntarily just left? Yes, absolutely, and that definitely gets addressed time after time again to the point you just beating that old horse into the ground. But it should also be addressed just as much with that same amount of energy is the fact that good brothers, good men who were great husbands and fathers were unjustly kicked out because of this democratic policy. All right. And on top of that, uh, not just with the family structure, you see, back in the day, because of that, there was a man by the name of Patrick F. Monaheim who had that report titled The Negro Family, A Case for National Action. And for anybody who's read that, you would think that it was a Republican or a conservative writing about this because nowadays they mention that a lot about the nuclear family, which they are correct about. But Patrick F. Monahan was a Democrat. The very same people, the very same party that we've been backing and been so loyal to for the past 50 plus years. One of the representatives was telling the truth about what happened as a result of the breakdown of the family. So this was way before what we're seeing today in the political process with one of the talking points. This was happening while it was happening in the 60s. All right. And on top of that came desegregation and also with integration to where all the businesses we had back then before the 60s, going back to what we had in regards to Black Wall Street, went right out the window. And in regards to Black Wall Street, it was terrible what happened to our ancestors at that time. But one point that's not talked about or even mentioned is the fact that Black Wall Street was built up again a second time, even better than before. You see, and that's just one of those little nuggets of information that's kept from us. That's why it's important to do your own research in regards to forget knowledge and information like that regarding you, your people, and your history. So again, definitely another valid point made by Mr. Sowell.
Characterize the liberal philosophy today from the conservative philosophy?
Oh, that's a tough one. I guess the main thing about the liberals, again, is that they think a program will do it. If there's something that they don't like in the society, you have set up a program and that will solve the problem. I think one of the things one of the words they use a lot is solutions. And I argue here and elsewhere that there are no solutions. There are just trade offs. So, for example, when Ralph Nader launched his attack against the Corvair many years ago, he said it's an unsafe car and has these safety problems and those safety problems. And in some respects, he was correct, not all. But the fact is, there were other things that a Corvair would do that made it safer than other cars. And on net balance, it was as safe as the rest of them.
Are you saying there are no solutions to our problems as Americans?
There are no solutions to anybody's problems. There are trade-offs. Safety is a classic example. Every year, so many hundreds of thousands of people are vaccinated against measles, smallpox, those kinds of things. Now, this saves several hundred lives, it's estimated. It also causes brain damage to about 30 kids a year. Now, there are no solutions in that. There are just trade-offs.
What about crime? Take crime as an issue. Can we solve?
Well, first, I wanted this before he gets into the aspect about crime. Uh, Not only the school system, but even vaccines too. Man, again, my man was on point. And back then, now this was like in the '90s, even before that. Vaccines definitely, like in regards to trade-offs. Yeah, you could say that vaccines save hundreds of millions of lives, but it could also, use an example he said, causes brain cancer to 30 children a year. Well, jump up to 2023 today, right? Honestly, going back to 2020 when this whole COVID pandemic, really scamdemic occurred. Honestly, it was true that people died from that coronavirus. But again, a lot of people recovered from it because the COVID, not vaccine, but the coronavirus, excuse me, had like a 99.9% recovery rate. And especially if you have a strong immune system, you're working out, you're eating right, you have in moderation in regards to what you eat and things and drink. As long as you do that, and also, and most important, you get the proper amount of sleep, then for the most part, you won't have to worry about that, man. And that's definitely the case with a lot of these people wearing masks, man. Even though the masks themselves don't really prevent you from getting the virus itself, man. Uh, and on top of that, as bad as the virus is itself, what's even worse is in regards to these COVID vaccines, which, what I've heard, not only gives you cancer, whether it be brain cancer or any other type of cancer, but it could also lower a person's IQ. And what I've heard also affects women in regards to pregnancy issues. I think about 300% or so. Is also affecting people in regards to mental health issues about 1,000%, right? And I've heard these numbers before, but if I'm wrong about those statistics, you can correct me. You can give me the real uh, statistics, the percentages, in the comments. But I think it's somewhere around that. But either way, I mean, it's affecting people in many various areas. And that's why, again, people in mainstream media don't like to address these facts. All right. Because again, in regards to these people, again, Tom calls the anointed, they're about their vision. They could really care less about what really happens to the common everyday people, just so as long as their vision is completed, right? It's completed, it's spread out throughout the world, and they can again just pat themselves on the back on a job well done. And the rest is just simply history.
Solve the crime issue or fundamentally solve it so it's reduced.
Well, then that's a trade-off. You don't solve it. There will always be crime. There always has been, but you want to keep.
Exactly. Again, and the reason why there always be crime is because, again, going back to what I stated about, uh, again, the Great Society. Not only see what happens when you take the father out of the home, it it causes many of these children, particularly the young men, the young boys who grow up into be young men, to go out into the streets and try to find a father figure within these gangs. And that's why so many young cats join gangs, because the people who are in lead, right, who are the head of these different gangs, like the Bloods, Crips, like that, is because they themselves grew up without fathers. And that's possibly by far, you know, the number one issue, particularly within Black America, but it's also affecting other parts of America too and other communities. But for some reason, I don't feel like to talk about that for whatever reason. But that's definitely a huge connection regards to father absence in criminal activity. So, And so the reason why there'll never be a solution in regards to that is because uh, they want to keep that going. They want there to be as many fatherless homes as possible. I'm speaking particularly of the Democratic Party because they're the ones behind that. Because if there was ever, if it was ever to happen to where the family structure through a process of elimination of many negative stimuli in these communities, in these households, were to go away, and to where the father gets placed, or more so takes his rightful spot back in the home, to where he could be a positive force, a positive light, positive role model example for his wife and his children. Uh, Democrats, for the most part, will pretty much lose their careers overnight, and they can't have that.
Keep it down to some level, it's not this astronomical thing we have today. For example, the liberals right now are saying, crime has eased off in New York, and that's true. Uh, there were there were 6 times as much crime in New York a few years ago as there was in 1960. Now it's down to 5 times as much crime as there was in 1960. Now that's not what I regard as a great trend, unless it continues a lot more
Well,
sharply.
liberals think we need more education and we need to help people in the inner city more to cut down crime there. Conservatives would say we have to be tougher on crime. Is either of them correct? Or
Oh,
both?
I no. You see, the conservative view is really not a solution. It's a trade off. It says, yes, it would be wonderful if we could do all these things to prevent crime in the first place. We just don't happen to be that smart. And so what we do, we put people behind bars who commit violent crimes. Now, a few years ago in East Palo Alto, which is not far from Stanford University, minority community, low income, they had the doubtful distinction of being the murder capital of the United States in proportion to their population. Uh, the next year, murder and all sorts of other violent crimes dropped tremendous amount, 30, 40, 50% in 1 year. Now, that wasn't because they discovered the root causes of crime or because they worked out everything was wonderful. They launched a campaign that put a lot of the bad guys behind bars. And when they were behind bars, they didn't commit as many crimes.
That
Uh,
makes sense to me.
and the thing that even in a high crime area, the great majority of the people are not criminals. And so if you can just
Absolutely, great point. That's true. The vast majority of people in these communities, and again, especially in the black community, unfortunately, because that's where crime is happening the most. But even though it's not the vast majority of people, because most people in the black communities, if you live in those communities, are just um, normal, everyday, law-abiding citizens who are trying to make ends meet and trying to raise their families as best as they can, given their situation. But it's more so the reason why a lot of these crimes are so rampant within our communities is because of the minority of degenerates within those communities, right? Basically, a minority within a minority, and and that's why, even though again, the most of the people who don't commit crimes, who are not viewed as criminal, well, they're not. Well, they can be viewed as criminals. That's not just criminals. It could be thugs, drug dealers, gang bangers. Um, in regards to the men, for the women, you thought a hoe, a baddie, you know, slut, terms like that. For females who just automatically just abort their children, right, left and right, who are laying down with many different types of men, even in some cases, even with women, experimenting, right? And the reason why, again, you can be a black man or a black woman or both who don't fit any of those descriptions, and you're the complete opposite: moral, upstanding, upright, respectful, kind, courteous, you're educated, you have an independent, critical thinking mind, you're not on drugs, you're not a drinker, you're not doing drugs, none of that stuff. You're married, you're not having children out of wedlock, you're not doing any of these things that we see and hear about so much in these different areas with these different platforms because, well, you're right. And again, and the reason why we're still viewed that way by outside stimuli is because, again, it's this huge elephant. I would say 800 or even 1,000 pound elephant in the room that doesn't like to get addressed within the black community. It's the fact that these niggas out here make the rest of us look bad. All right. And that's the reason why. And until we deal with that issue right there, um, that those racial stereotypes are always going to persist. So at the end, something's got to give.
Just put your hands on those people who are raising all the hell in the community and take them out of circulation. The crime rate drops.
Exactly. So basically, so in other words, they're going to come to a point where those people who are raising all this hell in the community, uh, that I just mentioned, are going to have to be excommunicated from the communities, all of them. And then once we do, and that happens, watch how fast and how quickly the rates and percentages of crime drop. So that's definitely a great point there.
People say there's undue emphasis on African Americans for committing crimes. Is that true? Ed Koch wrote in a column here that the population is 25% African American in New York. 62% of the crimes are committed by African Americans. Is that and he says
I haven't checked these figures, but yeah, throughout the world, this is not unusual. Throughout the world, people are disproportionately represented in all kinds of different things, and it's true, obviously, in basketball. It's true in all kinds of other things. The main thing is not to keep people out of jail because they're one race or another, because when you do that, the people who are going to suffer the most will be the black community.
Where are you on affirmative action?
Against.
Absolutely, because I heard about, I think it's about like 90 or plus percent of blacks are victims of other blacks. In the same way within Caucasian communities, about 85 or so percent of whites, if not higher or less, are killed by other whites. So that's definitely a great point, because the people, the demographics within a certain community, a certain city or state, are for the most part are always going to be um, attacked, threatened, or even killed by those of their own race, because most of the time they live amongst they live amongst one another. All right, so that's how it works, especially in places, even in some parts of New York and others that are segregated. That's that makes it even more true.
Why?
Well, you can only do one of two things. You can either just judge people individually, or you can judge them by groups. This whole notion that you're going to come out with a compromise, I would defy anybody to come out with a compromise on that. You're going to do one of those two things. Now, you can pretend to be doing other things, but that's all you're going to do. Those are the only two choices you really have in the end. Again, the people who are the anointed think of this as a symbolic issue, and they want to be on the side of the angels. They don't ask, what are the consequences? Now, I've studied affirmative action programs around the world. One of the consequences is that those people who are more fortunate in the group that has the preferences, those people take the lion's share of the preferences. Very often, those at the other end of the scale, poorer people, actually fall further behind. That's true of blacks here. It's true of Malays in Malaysia. It's true of various groups in India. And there are reasons for that. You can say you must have certain proportion. Nothing is easier than for an employer who might otherwise locate, let's say, in the Bronx, to locate out in Provo, Utah, where he will be not near any black people, and therefore he will never have lawsuits, and the jobs will be in Provo, and people will wonder, why don't people, here have more jobs? Uh, it never seems to occur to liberals that other people are not blocks of wood, that when you set up certain incentives, they will react to them in certain ways. And when they do that, the result may be the opposite of what you set out to do.
Excellent point. Yep. Couldn't say it better myself. However, if I can add to it though, and that's definitely a very in-depth analysis when it comes to affirmative action, because even though it sounds good on paper, what it does is it helps the poor people, the minorities like blacks and Latinos, get into certain colleges and universities. Even though, and I also heard Thomas himself mention this, that the universities that certain blacks are placed into, certain blacks and even Latinos are placed into, don't quite match up well with one another, and that's why they don't end up doing well in some of those places. In regards to test scores, they can taking tests and they can end up on a lower percentile, right? Things like that. And as a result of things like this, even though according to these in, intellectuals or the intelligentsia, it seems like they're doing a good thing, but they don't really understand or realize, nor even care to understand or realize that those actions are going to create a negative stigma for both groups because it's going to make it appear as though they can't get by on their own through their own hard work, their own merit, their own focus, commitment, dedication, consistency, self determination, grit, a positive attitude, mindset, things like that. And so when if you can't if you can't get by on your own, then it's like, I mean, what's left? What's your life going to be like? Is it going to just be like where you're always going to have other people do things for you, even though if you're fully capable of doing them yourself? You know, it's again, this is why that's why with people like with, or in this case with friends like liberals, aka intellectuals, aka intelligentsia, you definitely don't need no enemies.
How do the anointed refer to people they don't agree with?
All sorts of ways. But I think the main thing is they believe that you're not merely in error, but in sin. In other words, they can't believe that you're just mistaken. You must have sold out. You must be something warped about you.
You guys are for the rich.
Oh, that's definitely the case today, man. In regards to racial issues, uh, like with CRT, critical race theory, in regards to this gender inequality between men and women, gender identity, in regards to what's going on with children, all types of areas, even in sports, politics. Yeah, I mean, it never ends. So that's why, again, you have to have really thick skin to pretty much be able to function in a society like this, where almost everything you say that's outside of what the elites want you to think, feel, and believe is pretty much going to have you cast in a negative light.
Rich.
Mm,
You guys only care about the rich guys.
mm.
Answer that. How do you respond? Liberal says conservatives only care about rich people.
Well, one of the things I go into in the book is that the whole notion of rich is ridiculous. That most Americans don't stay in the same income bracket, even for one decade. So the same guy who is, quote, rich now was 20 years ago probably in the bottom 20%. I mean, I was on a cruise recently, luxury cruise, and the guy said, you know, if someone had told me when I was growing up that I would end up on a cruise like this, I would have said, get real, man. You know, that very few people are in that same income bracket the whole time. The
Right.
genuinely rich and the genuinely poor, I would estimate to be no more than 3% of the American people
Really?
put together.
Really?
Yes.
Genuinely poor. Now I'm seeing numbers like when they were talking about healthcare, they said 30 million people couldn't afford it or something. That's a big number.
Several million of those were making more than $50,000 a year. So it's not. See, this is one of the things the Anointed do. They never believe that people make choices. There are people who have the money. They prefer to put that money into a BMW rather than into
A lot of
healthcare.
young people didn't want healthcare. They were betting on their health.
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
then this allows them to buy more stuff they want to buy. So it's not a question that they couldn't afford it. It's a question they don't choose to spend the money.
Absolutely, and again, people do have choices, and depending on how much money they make, what they do with that money is definitely their own. Is definitely their right and definitely their own business. And that's why again, man, you have to you have to be be mindful of how you come off in saying certain things, right? Like in regards to like the rich and the poor. Again, that's another great example in something we're seeing right now. Because the reason I say that is because a big reason why you have this war between both sides is because of the eliminating of the middle class. All right. So when you have the middle class, it creates that buffer, it creates that balance. So that way, neither side will always constantly be each other's throats, like we're seeing today. And again, yes, especially in regards to when it comes to being rich or more so wealthy, that can definitely change throughout decades and throughout generations. To where at one point, whether you were rich at one point, but maybe a couple of generations down, you you could be you could become poor or not as well off as you were before. And it could be the opposite, where you could be dirt poor. You could barely have two nickels or dimes or pennies to rub together, but about 20, 30 years and a couple of generations later on, you're rich. You're wealthy. You have your own business, right? You have your own empire. Mhm. All you have like your own Wall Street or something like that. So yeah, those are definitely things to keep in mind in that regards to that issue. Now, in regards to again, going back to what I said about health. If you're taking care of yourself and you're keeping everything up on the up and up, you don't have to worry so much about getting health care, especially if you're young. Now, if you're older, that's a different story. But again, it all goes back to the money you make and what you do with it is entirely up to you, and rightfully so, because you have to be pretty much pretty much outright condescending to assume that you believe you know what's best for people in regards to how they should spend their money. When I'm pretty sure if you are quote unquote one of these elites, you wouldn't even um, you would not yourself like other people telling you how you should spend your money. All right, so it's like do as I say, not as I do, and that's why these liberals, aka leftists, today more so are the perfect definition of a walking contradiction.
What about mean spirited? Conservatives are mean spirited. They're bigots. They don't like people.
Well, one of the things I tell people say, you're a very tough person. I'm not tough. Life is tough. I'm merely trying to acquaint you with those facts.
Hey, simple yet profound. Life is tough, all right, because regardless of your race, your creed, your ethnic background, your culture, your gender, etc., everybody experiences unfairness in life, and whether it's in regards to situations that you're in control of or you're not in control of, is always the case. And that's why, even though life is tough, at the same time, it's how you handle that toughness. It's how you handle that unfairness, right? Because situations in life that are meant to be tough, that are meant to make you feel uncertain, is to make you strong, is to make you build character, perseverance, um, a determination, and that strong fighting willing spirit. That's what it's about overall when it comes to this thing we call life. And and that's why again nowadays where you have these people on the far left, for what I'm seeing, that are always trying to blame everything on the outside stimuli as opposed to looking within and having you ask yourself, what could I have done to do this better? What could I have done to avoid this pitfall? What could I have done to handle this situation better? What could I have said as opposed to what I said here, done here, believed here? Again, all areas that makes you have to look within yourself, because many times people don't like to look within themselves because they're afraid of what they're going to see. Like, and like it's like that. It sounds a little cliche, but it's like that hit Michael Jackson song, "Man in the Mirror," which is very true though. The person you have to, you know, blame first and foremost, if and when things don't go your way, is you, and that's very hard for people nowadays because, again, everyone is so used to playing the blame game, and that's why victimhood is so popular nowadays because almost everyone wants to be a victim, especially if it pays. So, I mean, like, hey, if you want to be a victim at the same time, might as well get a payout. That's why it's a trip.
Back in the 60s, Lyndon Johnson announced a war on poverty.
Mm.
Am I wrong? But there are more poor people. I mean, in other words,
Today than there were then, yes.
Yeah, there are more poor people.
Yes.
I mean, this was a hell of a war. We lost it, apparently, because for the last 30 years, we've been dumping money into these poverty programs.
Oh, absolutely.
Where's the money go?
Oh, it supports a whole industry of people who run those programs, who talk about those programs, research those programs, bureaucrats, and so on.
Doesn't help poor people.
No. The tragedy, you see, is that the Anointed really want to make symbolic statements. And running these programs makes those symbolic statements. They don't really care if in the wake of affirmative action, for example, companies start locating away from minority communities so they don't even get involved in legal action. They don't care about that. They've made their statement on the side of the angels, and that's what's important.
Exactly. And that's why with a lot of these poverty programs, it makes it to where people who are suffering because of these policies, which again goes back to what happened in the 60s, from that point up to today, has created, for the most part, a plantation, particularly a democratic plantation, right? To where poverty is, if I'm going to phrase it this way, seem um, more attractive. What I mean by that is, yeah, you may be in poverty, but to try to make it as comfortable for you as possible, so that way you don't this one day wake up and decide to yourself that I'm sick and tired of being in poverty, of being poor. So I'm gonna take it upon myself to try and get myself out of this situation by honestly, particularly leaving that party and going in, and I would say what to do for yourself, how to make your own money, trying to go into like a trade school or something, for example, as a means of bettering yourself and raising your status. The people behind these programs can't have that. So that's why, and with these programs, it creates the modern day slaves without the chains. And again, if they try to see, and if they see anybody attempting to get off that plantation, all they gotta do is have one of their overseers um, reel them back in. All right, and that's their blueprint.
Have you ever debated Jesse Jackson?
No, I haven't.
Is that because, would you like to, or would he not want to do that?
I have no idea.
You'd be willing to, I assume.
Oh, maybe. I don't know.
You think that's too much showbiz?
It is. There are people who go and do this, and I'm doing less and less of it. And I tell them the story of an African boxing champion who fought an Irishman in St. Patrick's Day in Dublin, and he lost his title on what the sports writers called a questionable decision.
Yes.
And so you have to know what forum you're talking about.
Right.
I saw Shelby Steele on with him, and I said, if Jesse Jackson and Shelby Steele each had to present a 2-hour lecture to an audience with an average IQ of 120, Shelby would wipe him out. But if they had 5 seconds each on Donahue, it would be Jesse Jackson all the way.
Right.
So everything depends upon the forum.
Exactly. Because in regards to what he stated about Shelby Steele, if he were to have a debate with Jesse Jackson, of course he'll wipe him out because depending on not just the forum, but the audience that they're debating in front of, you know, that audience could be definitely more conservative or more or lean more right. Whereas in regards to the Donahue show, Jesse Jackson would definitely win because not just again with that forum, but with the audience there, they would definitely be more liberal, right, or lean more towards the left. So again, that's definitely the case. It all depends on those two factors. It all depends on your environment.
Uh, is Jesse Jackson good for African Americans or
No,
not?
he's
He's
good
not.
for himself.
Good for himself.
And that's true of most ethnic leaders in most groups, in most countries, in most periods of history. That what will serve his interest is to keep people paranoid, dependent upon him, dependent upon government. What will serve their interest is typically just the opposite.
Exactly, because a lot of these leaders, not just quote black leaders, but again, leaders of other different ethnic groups are handpicked. All right, it's to make the people believe that those who look like you and who are from your tribe are for you and for your benefit. But again, it can also come down to them just simply being a double agent, playing both sides. All right, basically the enemy from within.
That's pretty interesting. So you're saying that the leaders, whatever group,
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
leader, wants the people to be poor and dependent on them as opposed to dependent on themselves.
Oh, absolutely. And you see this in the greatest cynicism in the academic world, where in many places, black organizations on campus have a say on who gets admitted. And they have turned down blacks with excellent credentials, both as students and as faculty members, for that very reason.
Who are the mascots?
And sure, and I bet I would not be surprised if for the blacks who turned down those blacks who were not only well qualified and have very high credentials, I would not be surprised if those very people are a parties, fraternities, and sororities, aka the boule or the black bourgeoisie. I would not be surprised by that at all because I'm pretty sure 9 times out of 10 that's what he's referring to.
Mascots of the Anointed. You talk about the mascots of the Anointed.
There are people whom they choose to back and whose rights are supposed to override other people's rights. The homeless are a classic example. I'm appalled when I see people out there in the street giving money to the home. I mean, able-bodied men. I think one of the classic pictures to me was in San Francisco when there was this able-bodied white man out in the street begging, and there's this black lady coming along there, very modestly dressed, like she didn't have, but she's stopping to open her purse to give him some money. I thought, good heavens, have we really come to this? And we've been brainwashed by the Anointed into thinking this is what we ought to do.
What do you say?
Oh yeah, definitely a very good example right there because where you go in life, where you see whether you go into a bus station or outside your house on a street corner, where you see somebody down on your luck. That's definitely that is very true. And it's not to say that you should not help those people. You should. You should always help somebody who's less fortunate than you are, particularly if you have a very caring heart and spirit behind that, and you're doing it because you want to do that, because you're sincere about it, right? Absolutely. But I do agree, however, at the other side, Um, some of these people out here that you may think are homeless are, are probably most likely acting, trying to play on your heartstrings. All right, and they're probably set up as as pawns, as part of their as part of like a campaign or something like that, politically or socially. All right, so that's why it's very important to have that discernment to so to say, okay, whether or not if this is for real or if it's too good to be true.
Say to guys who bum money off of you.
Not all of it can be repeated on the air, but the fact is they don't get any money.
They don't.
And people who complain now about all these people begging in the street, there's a simple answer: don't give them money, and they won't be in the street.
Exactly, and on top of that, and if you can't encourage them to um, no longer to stop seeing themselves as incapable of making it in the world, in society, especially today, when there are more ways to make money now than ever before. Right, and ain't just regards to a 9 to 5 job, but the current business model nowadays is honestly you be in the comfort of your own home, making videos and podcasts. And if you're on YouTube, for example, you see numerous channels, hundreds of different channels of people doing so. All right, and probably making a lot more than what they do at these other jobs. All right, and that's why and that's why, from my perspective, my opinion, that's why there's a shortage of workers at these jobs, is because people who are utilizing this outlet, their attitude and mentality is, I'm making a lot more money doing this. Why do I need a 9 to 5 job for? All right, so anybody can make it. You know, when it comes to making money, it just depends on um, who you are. It depends on how creative you are, what ideas you have. If you have any passion behind those ideas, which is definitely needed. Because if you're just doing something just for the sake of doing it, what's the point? And on top of that, what's even just as important and probably even more important than passion is courage. All right. And that's why Morgan Freeman was right on point when he said that courage is the key to life itself. And that's 100% true. Because it's not so much, on some level it can be laziness, but it's also fear, because it's that fear of failure. Well, you have to understand everyone is going to fail in life and something that they attempt to do. But it doesn't matter whether you fail or not. What matters most is, all right, if you fail, are you willing to get back up? Are you willing to try again? Keep trying and trying and trying over and over and over again until you get to where you want to be in life. That's the question. For some people who have that mentality, they have that fire, they have that drive, and unfortunately others don't. And instead just prefer to live a life of mediocrity.
When you wrote this, what were you trying to accomplish with the book, and did you do it? Were you nailing liberals for 30 years of social policy? What were you trying to say?
I was trying to reveal the thinking behind that, the kinds of assumptions, the kind of world that exists inside their mind, and therefore why those assumptions are so dangerous in the long run. It's not just the policies mentioned in that
They
book.
think they're better than everybody else.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. And that's what makes them dangerous. Even all the policies that are mentioned there, 20 years from now, those policies may not be the policies we're concerned about. But that mindset will still be there. And what makes them tremendously dangerous is that facts that contradict what they believe are simply ignored or evaded.
Where does the press fall into this?
Oh, absolutely, man. Are we not seeing that right now? I mean, that mindset is can be identified and associated with people today, like I mentioned before, the LGBTQP mafia, or more so the alphabet mafia. A lot of these activist groups out here, like BLM, Antifa, all right, feminists, aka feminazis, all right, a lot of different groups out here who are being bankrolled by the elites, who themselves don't even really believe what they're pushing, all right. But the purpose is to get you to believe that, and to see how you're going to respond and how you're going to deal with it. So it's pretty much a comedy of errors.
As the Anointed group, are they part of the
Oh,
Anointed?
absolutely. They're a major part of it because one of the reasons that people don't get many of the facts that go against what's believed is that the press doesn't choose to publicize those facts.
Give me an example.
Exactly, because if the facts were published or broadcast, then the masses of people at large would no longer need them. Like, right, the same way as a child, the same way if you're a child growing up, right? As you were young, when you were young, your parents would hold your hand everywhere you walk, right? Or if you're going to school, they'll walk you to the bus, so things of that nature. But as you got older and you got of age and you became more, more aware of your surroundings, you became more mature, then your parents didn't have to hold your hand no more. And then they have to, walk you to the bus anymore. You get to the point you start doing it more and more yourself. And that right there teaches them how to navigate in the world. Especially and that's the thing, when you do things by yourself, you you have that big great that you have that huge feeling of accomplishment. You feel good about yourself because okay, you accomplished this. If you can put you can accomplish that, you can put your mind and accomplish anything you want. You just have to have that feeling of belief and that strong sense of confidence.
Something the press might not cover or cover well.
Oh, a few years ago, there was a story about prenatal care among blacks, that black women get less prenatal care than white women. The infant mortality rate is higher among blacks. They immediately assume that one causes the other. One of the things I like to do is go back to the original source and find out what it said. I went back. On the very same page where it said that, the figures showed Mexican Americans get even less prenatal care than blacks, and they have a lower infant mortality rate than whites. So prenatal care and infant mortality rate have nothing to do with each other. If you break it down further, black women who have only a high school education, but who are married, their children have lower infant mortality rates than white women who have a college education who are unwed mothers. So it's not race, it's not income, it's not education, it's lifestyle. When you live a certain way, there are consequences to that. The media doesn't want to accept that. Because if you say people's lifestyles have a lot to do with the outcome, then there's no room for the anointed.
Exactly. And with that, that's why it all comes down to personal responsibility and accountability, which is which is basically kryptonite to the Democratic Party, the liberals, leftists, or in this case, the quote unquote anointed, as Tom calls them. And that's why, again, when you look at yourself in the mirror and when you figure out and you come to the conclusion, you realize that what you're doing is not working out for you, and it's just creating more stress, more anxiety, depression, bad luck, right? Then you have to come to, you know, or in this case, first off, you have to humble yourself and say to yourself, okay, with all these things that I'm going through right now, that I'm experiencing, what can I do personally to change it all around? And again, what if more and more people had that mindset and mentality, we would have nowhere near the problems that we have in regards to prenatal care, family structure, education, economics, right? Social, political, all pretty much all areas of life. All right, and that's something that doesn't get talked about. But that's why it's important. That's why and it's to be said, that's why you're having more of these alternative outlets now, where people are going to because they're not trusting the mainstream media anymore. For definitely for good reason. So that's definitely a plus. But anyway, that's it for this video. I just wanted to touch on this, and I thought it was a very, very good segment right here, especially in regards to which was that interview you had when it comes to the origins of wokeism, the people behind it, and most importantly, how to overcome it. So, I'm out. Peace.